fun, thank you. Thank you, Ashlyn, for that amazing introduction. We had some time scheduled to introduce ourselves, but you did a great job. Thank you so much. So I'm Ruth McGuiness, and I lead Keynote's AI Centre of Excellence, and we're focused really specifically on the adoption of Microsoft's AI technology stack. And joining me on the panel is Lyndsay, who leads the data and analytics team in Danske Bank UK, and of course Danske are a leading bank in Northern Ireland, but also across Europe as well, which lends a really unique perspective. And also Egen from Control Risks in her role as Commercial Director, and Ashlyn's already set the scene that Caitlin is really operating across a kind of a global jurisdiction. So you've found yourself into the AI Now track, which means that you weren't dazzled by the potential of the AI Next track, right? You want to know what's happening in enterprise organizations today. You want to understand what some of the challenges are and how real organizations actually today are really navigating that, and maybe that can offer some perspective as to how far ahead you are or far behind as a business. I wanted to kind of start with kind of my perspective on this. So working really closely with Microsoft has been, a roller coaster this year in terms of the kind of the rapid pace of kind of how they're advancing their AI products within their technology stack, and it's incredibly impressive to watch how they're bringing AI capability down through their traditional business application stack. So, generative AI capabilities within Microsoft Word, Outlook. There's even a Copilot formula in Excel now. That has happened so quickly, within 6 months, and have you even noticed it? And so really what they're pushing is a mass adoption of AI technologies within an enterprise setting, really as a movement and not as a choice in some ways. And that's kind of building, AI capability across your organization if you've unlocked that functionality. But they're also equally investing in their citizen developer tools for AI alongside that. So the likes of Copilot and Copilot Studio and Azure AI Foundry, they're making it commoditized, easier than ever before to kind of develop complex AI systems and do that in a really super commoditized way. And what does that mean? It means that people are excited to use these tools, and actually the rate of adoption has skyrocketed across enterprise organizations, and it's created a real friction point is what I'm sort of witnessing, is that the people want these tools in their hands, and I think that organizations are sort of struggling to keep up with that expectation in some ways, and I think are struggling to understand the risks, as they evolve. I think we're not really at a place where we know how to govern these tools. What does it mean if 500 people in your company have built an agent? Do we know what they're using it for? Has anyone really got the answer to that question yet? From my experience of maybe talking to over 200 companies the last 6 months, I don't think so, right? I think we're all kind of feeling it out, and maybe that gives Lyndsay and Caitlin some relief that I'm not expecting them to tell us the answers today. But we're going to just, within that context, I think we want to dive into the very real experiences of kind of two UK leading organizations who are operating at that enterprise level to just, learn different perspectives from Lyndsay in the data space and Caitlin from a commercial director perspective. What does this look like within your business? How have you navigated it? What are some of the lessons that you can learn? And it's okay that if you don't have all the answers. So to start with, we're going to allow kind of Lyndsay and Caitlin just to give a bit more context about their organization and their kind of AI experiences there, and then we're going to jump into some questions that'll dig a bit deeper, I think, on some of the hot topics that we might want to hear about. So, Lyndsay, I will pass over to you first.
Sure, thank you. Okay, so probably many people have heard of Danske Bank. We are one of the biggest banks here in Northern Ireland with over 500,000 personal and business customers. We bank some of the most successful businesses here in Northern Ireland and therefore have a really important role in the economy here. Our core market is here in NI, but we're growing in pockets of opportunity in the rest of GB. Headquartered in Copenhagen, so part of Danske Bank Group, which is a large Nordic organization. But that position in the wider group, and it's been a thread actually today, it's a strength for us and positions us well when it comes to digital transformation and AI, because we benefit from having access to that wider group infrastructure, platform, security. But locally, we can usually make decisions quite quickly, and that means we can drive change quickly, and we also have a level of autonomy, so we have the best of both. In terms of, I suppose, where we are with AI, AI has been around in financial services for a long time now, and it's the traditional type of AI systems like transaction monitoring, fraud detection. You know, they're well-established models already working very well. I suppose when Gen AI broke through a couple of years ago from a group point of view, we saw the opportunity, both group and here we invested in it. And as we stand today, so we have released Danske GPT to all 1,400 colleagues here and to over 20,000 colleagues across the group. We developed our first Northern Irish language model with our own unique dialect taken into consideration. We've rolled out some of the Microsoft stacks, so Copilot, GitHub. We're currently developing a suite of, we call them smart assistants, so RAG-powered LLMs to help colleagues navigate their policies, and have started developing our first true agentic use case. Yeah, so great solutions, but it's been about much more than that. We've also developed a responsible AI framework, put a lot of focus on skills, adoption. It's Gen AI week next week internally, so everyone has access to a whole host of sessions and training, but it's an ongoing focus for us. And then another key part has been actually weaving AI into our medium and longer term plans as well.
Great. Caitlin?
Hi everyone, so I'm Caitlin and I'm at a company called Control Risks. We're a 50-year-old security company. We actually started in the kidnap for ransom response space, and since then we've rapidly grown. We basically position ourselves as an organization that helps protect, manage and respond to security risks associated with assets and people. And to give you a bit of flavor, that can be anything from protecting executives on the way to Davos or Japanese executives on the ground in Ukraine, through to working with hyperscalers on global red team programs for their data centers. I actually sit in the digital and cyber risk team, so we work a lot with boards and executives in enterprise organizations who are leveraging new technology, trying to roll out new technology such as AI. They're also really concerned about how new technology, not just AI, but also the quantum race, is playing out in the sort of threatscape against them, also at a competition level. And of course, we're navigating now a very unique geopolitical environment where the regulatory regime is fragmenting quite rapidly. And to be honest, we've seen the collapse of the enterprise model worldwide. So it's a very challenging time for a lot of organizations, but there's also many taking a lot of opportunity and doubling down in certain markets, such as China, which has a very impressive regulatory regime when it comes to AI, but it is quite strict. Yeah, I guess I can give a sort of broad perspective on many of the things that we're seeing, how AI technology is being used to manage different security risks, but equally how our clients are using it and managing those risks themselves. I suppose my personal background before Control Risks, I was actually at a crypto startup, so a lot of buzzwords, crypto, AI, any VCs in the room. But we started playing around with large language models to help us scale crypto investigations. I'd say we probably did it in quite a high-risk way because we literally were playing around with agents in the early days. And I wouldn't recommend allowing agents to handle complex investigations. But it was fun, and I did learn a lot. And it's interesting to now be at like a much bigger global company where we are tasked with risk management. So we have to take things a little more carefully ourselves. But yeah, hopefully I can share some insights and have a good discussion.
Great. And I think maybe I'll come straight back to you, Caitlin, for the first question. So I think we're all kind of talking about scaling AI in the enterprise, but I think we're coming at it all from different perspectives, different organizations. And so I think it would be really great to understand, from control risk perspective, how, what does AI mean to control risks at the moment? And is the focus on, technology adoption, people readiness, cultural change? What's the kind of perspective there?
That's a great question, because I'd say, like many global businesses, we've been facing our fair share of challenges. China is a big market for us. Russia was a big market for us. We had to get out of Russia and help a lot of companies exit Russia. So we sort of have had to be reorganizing ourselves at a global level anyway, and then AI comes onto the scene. So I'd say, as much as I'd like to say it's an orchestration between people, culture, and technology, it ultimately starts at the people layer. I think just like cyber, AI has to be owned by the executives. They set the strategy, they set the vision, which drives the culture, whether that's hiring decisions through to the innovation culture, through to security and governance. And technology plays a dual role of both being the foundation, so obviously it's up to the sort of data readiness of the organization, through to actually obviously being the catalyst once you adopt new technologies, and it can add all sorts of benefits, but again, the business impact has to be clear, and the executives have to understand what that impact is, because that justifies the investment and the onboarding of these systems.
And maybe a follow-on question: are you kind of at the point where you're putting the technology in the hands of the people, or is it still kind of a governance-led approach within your organization?
It's governance-led, but we're rolling it out. We have Copilot.
That's what I was looking for. Thanks.
We have our own internal language model, and we are using it in really interesting ways in some of our more sensitive security programs. Like we run person of interest programs, which informs executive protection. It's sort of monitoring the online sphere, deep and dark web. And obviously there's a lot of data to get through, so we are leveraging it to help us scale those investigations. Great.
And Lyndsay, I think you gave us a good kind of summary there of some of the technology adoption across Danske Bank. And it's great, by the way, to hear that a lot of that's been driven by Danske Bank in Northern Ireland. You're seen as kind of an innovator within the group, which is fantastic. I think, and a good reflection of the skills here in Northern Ireland. I'd love to hear though, kind of how is that cascading down into people and culture within Danske Bank? If you can comment on that.
Sure, and I think to your original question, I think it is definitely a blend of all, plus so much more. So it's your risk appetite, who your partners are, your customers and what their expectations are. But in terms of how we have kind of rolled it out and scaled, maybe to share a couple of practical examples. So back when it really took off for us, a year and a half, 2 years ago, we made a couple of movements so recognized obviously it was much more than just the technology, and it was a transformation. So took a couple of actions to lay the foundations to scale. So the first was recognizing our position in the group, and making sure that we had a seat at the table to get access to the technology, because that was really important. But even more important was to make sure we had a voice to be able to customize those group-wide solutions for our own people, our own market, and also really important to have like our own governance step in that, because we're regulated in the UK, of course. And then in terms of kind of our approach to scaling and how the whole organization was brought into play, and this sounds really basic, but one of the things we did was put a program structure around it, and that involved having executive sponsorship at the most senior levels in the bank, but cross-functionally. So the CIO, CRO, HR director, MD of personal operations, others, really cross-functionally guiding the implementation. And then the program itself was key pillars. Technology and use cases was one, but people, skills, adoption was equally important, as was governance. Third parties was a big piece for us, and then having a rolled up set of KPIs to guide us. So it was more of a transformation and equal focus on people and skills. And I think a learning point has probably been, it's really good to start a big initiative like that, but even more important to transition to a more integrated approach and make sure that ownership is anchored in business units right across the organization, but rolled up and aligned to the corporate strategy.
And I know I wouldn't ask you any questions that weren't on the list, but you've piqued my interest, because banking is such a relationship-based industry. Ultimately it's a people business. Mm-hmm. And I assume that there would be some hesitation, coming from an organization like that to kind of adopt automation technologies that could ultimately displace some of that relationship management. And I'm kind of curious, how has that been within Danske Bank, and how have you overcome that, if it's there?
Yes, there's probably a couple of points to that one. So we have been digitizing and automating processes for as long as that technology has been available. So in the beginning, this is more than 10 years ago, but it would have been a bit of a fear, and even before that in terms of process efficiency and lean and all those kind of disciplines. So back then it may have been a fear, but it's just become, quite a positive thing. Like, we are, as employees, very well protected, so creating efficiency is a positive thing for our organisation. And I suppose we've taken robotics now to a point of maturity, taken tens of thousands of hours out of the organisation, and are proud of that, and our people are as well. So, and the other piece is probably we made the conscious decision not, for the solutions that we have rolled out so far and the value that has been created, and including efficiency, we haven't reduced headcount because of that. So,
okay. Great, that's good to hear. I've been in with Danske Bank quite a few times, and I think the appetite, for using this technology is, so positive, and it's great to see. So I think moving more into kind of more of an emergent topic, right? Because I think, artificial intelligence technologies have been around for a long time. I think particularly in kind of heavily regulated industries where we've seen huge adoption over the years. But what we're seeing kind of this year is the emergence of more kind of agentic functionality, more kind of discussion around agents, which sort of applies, an autonomous sort of system that's kind of acting within an enterprise organization. And I'm kind of curious, Caitlin, maybe coming to you first to, understand, what are we seeing within your organization, even within the organizations that you work with, about, the adoption of agentic technologies versus maybe more traditional AI, and kind of if you have a viewpoint on that.
There's definitely a lot of interest in leveraging agents. As I said, I was at a startup where we were playing around with them quite early on. But I think, the risk calculus is different. So with LLMs, you're more concerned about data quality and bias and compliance. But agents introduces a whole realm of operational risk. And that makes it challenging because it can have much more real-world impacts in terms of the way it's being used maybe in HR or financial operations or customer service. So I guess in terms of rolling it out, typically we take the sort of trust but verify approach. Obviously, controls are really, really important. There has to be human in the loop around decision-making. And I feel like I'm going to be speaking a lot of themes today, but another big theme, and not just in AI, but in security in general, is resilience, so resilience by design. So moving towards an assumption that something will go wrong, an agent will make a bad decision, it will screw up. And how are you measuring those scenarios and those impacts so that you can then come up with the right ways to sort of contain it, whether that's like an immediate kill switch, to manage all the sort of risks, whether it's reputational risk through to direct security or even human life risks, is really important. And finally, sort of value and use case, ideally not rolling them out in high-risk areas just yet. I know Palantir and other companies are far ahead in that, but yeah, it's not advisable at this stage without the right risk and governance approach.
And maybe I can add kind of a Keynote perspective. So I'm, would speak to kind of hundreds of organizations who are going through the same challenge, and the trends that I'm sort of seeing in industry at the minute are that organizations are acknowledging and recognizing that agentic technologies are coming down through the products that they're using, and how they're reacting to that is treating AI as a continuum, almost. And so grouping it under, traditional AI systems versus things like Copilot Studio that are able to build agents, and really treating it as one broad brush AI, technology stack, and trying to build a centralized, governance structure around that. And, even we would do a lot of work with the UK government, and we're starting to see actually quite a huge amount of spend where government departments are looking for capability augmentation to kind of cover both, sort of traditional machine learning skills, but also kind of agentic technology skills plus low-code AI skills, right? It's kind of blurring into one. But I think ultimately the realization is that, if you can have control over the technologies ultimately that are driving a lot of that functionality, it becomes an enterprise risk question, it becomes an enterprise governance question. And the organizations that I think are winning in this space are the ones that are, putting the the tools into the hands of their people, but doing it in a way that allows them to experiment with an appropriate amount of governance that ultimately doesn't become a blocker, but becomes, a gated approach that allows the business to scale that usage. And, I think as Professor Spinelli said earlier, if you wait around, you will lose. Right, you will not get your governance right, with technologies that are evolving every 3 months, so you have to kind of get started, and that's the sort of trend that we're seeing in industry. And Lyndsay, I don't know if Danske Bank have kind of an agentic perspective, or if you're experimenting with those tools and how you're governing even within your centralized system.
Yeah, so we are obviously a bank, so approaching AI in general with a more risk-based, kind of prudent approach. So started off with those colleague-facing solutions. We do see the opportunity with agentic. In financial services, you've got big end-to-end, multi-step journeys and workflows with multiple small decisions made throughout them. So good use cases for agentic when you look at it that way. But obviously there's real considerations, especially when we're talking about enterprise processes and some of the more critical business processes we have, like onboarding a new customer, buying a home. So we are taking the approach to kind of a parallel track of developing single agent use cases, so discrete agents with one task, one skill. And in parallel, and this is where we lean on group as well, building central platform, guardrails and governance, and doing that as we learn, as we build. So.
And maybe I'll come straight back to you, Lyndsay, for the next one. So we're hearing, we've talked about, people want to use these tools. There's so much hype in industry about how amazingly transformational kind of AI is going to be for the efficiency of your role. So, if you don't have access to, Copilot or other cloud vendors exist, but you're going to want to try and experiment with these tools, right, within your organization, whether you have the license or not. And so we're hearing kind of about the rise of shadow AI, where employees are actually not being given access to these tools within their enterprise workflow, and so they're accessing them, through their own personal devices or even through their own kind of browsers, so maybe ChatGPT free version, and kind of bringing their business data down through those tools because they're accessible. And every single organization that I've spoken to this year has said that this is number one on their risk register for AI governance. And at the same time, they're saying, but we think it's actually too risky to put these tools into the hands of our people, so we're not sure what to do. So the situation is getting worse and worse, where people want to use these tools, there's an appetite, people want to innovate within their roles, and I think that the guardrails need to come up, a little bit to allow that to happen in tandem. But in saying that, I can recognize both perspectives, right? As an employee, you want the ability to innovate and to improve, how you work. But, from an organizational risk perspective, this represents, a challenge if people are really misusing company data or kind of misusing tools they don't really understand, So maybe coming, Lyndsay, over to you from a Danske Bank perspective, what does shadow AI look to your organization, and kind of where do you sit on that risk versus innovation?
I'm pro-innovation, I think, in terms of, everyone should be able to experiment with AI, but it must be grounded in governance. Financial services, it doesn't always feel like an advantage to be heavily regulated, but when it comes to dilemmas like this, we're in a really good position because regulation gives you frameworks, clear boundaries of what you can and can't do. So even through the lens of how we handle personal data, GDPR sets a high standard of how we process a customer's personal data. And even regardless of regulation, we take that responsibility really seriously. And then, in a bank, the stakes are high. So things like information classification, endpoint monitoring, we already have a shadow IT policy framework. So all these things are already in place and baked into our systems. So it is an advantage in a way because shadow AI is locked down for us. It's not possible, not allowed. So that's really clear. And I think for companies who don't have that clarity, it's really understanding the risks. So, worst case, it's data breach, it's introducing vulnerabilities into your system, security, fraud, all these things that have really high consequences. But I think there's probably things that any organization can do, ideally making these tools available to people because we need them to do our work. That's where we are now. So making some sort of AI solution available to your people in your secure environment is obviously the place you want to start. Making sure there's clear guidelines of what is and isn't approved for use. Creating ways to encourage innovation like hackathons, marketplaces, sandboxes. And I think upskilling is key, making sure people are equipped with the knowledge of what is right and wrong and what's safe and not. But overall, I think curiosity and AI go hand in hand, so we need to encourage it, but just in a safe and secure way.
And do you think that it's an expectation of every employee in every organization today to have access to tools like that?
I couldn't imagine working somewhere without. I got my laptop changed recently and lost my access to Danske GPT for a few days, and I
you had to use
struggled.
your brain. Caitlin, I think coming in kind of a follow-up question. So, shadow AI, it's a security consideration ultimately, right? Company data leakage into, unapproved kind of AI tools where there's no kind of certainty around what that's being used for, opens up greater risks like prompt injection, model manipulation. Do you think that this requires kind of new security approaches for enterprise organizations, or do existing kind of cyber frameworks stretch far enough?
So I have two things to say. Firstly, just touching on the last point you guys were making, we've seen a big program of work that's been growing quite rapidly for us is insider risk globally. And outside of the US, that typically means the way, employees are now using new technologies and introducing new risks into the organization around that. In the US, we're actually seeing a big focus on sort of threat to life, active shooter, things like that, but also the way AI is being used externally to more effectively emotionally manipulate employees to perhaps, share company secrets or leak data. So it's quite interesting because I would share all your insights that actually we have all these rigorous programs in place, but they're being tested a bit by these new technologies. And that's where I lead into the security framework. So typically with new technology, my perspective is it's not a technology issue, it's a new issue. So any new technology or new system you onboard will have risks that are introduced into the organization that are unique to that technology. The technology is, of course, being leveraged in the threat space as well, so that changes your threat environment to various degrees or enhances existing threats, such as spear phishing, which we've now seen become much more effective, leveraging large language models. But I think the challenge here is actually getting the right talent in-house. And if you don't have that talent in-house to help you understand and identify and assess those risks associated with AI, then you can leverage third parties in the short term while you upskill. But again, it comes back to this broader theme that we're seeing across the board, so not just with AI, which is the gap between security frameworks and resilience. So last year in the UK, we've had a pretty bad year when it comes to security incidents, Marks and Spencer's, Co-op, most recently Jaguar Land Rover, reputational damage, losing millions a day. And they are advanced organizations in cyber maturity. So what's going wrong? They're running tabletop exercises regularly, It's a challenging global ecosystem. We don't just have AI, we have supply chain aggregation, we have technology concentration, and then we have the geopolitical environment. So it's becoming really, really hard to map your ecosystem and the risks. We run a big global audit program for one of the big tech companies on their customer service sites globally across Africa and Asia. And these third parties have gone through the customer onboarding. There's contractual mechanisms in place. But through our audits, we found that some of these organizations were leveraging AI and running this big technology company's customer data through AI models. And that's something that they perhaps weren't expecting to find in an audit, where a lot of these organizations have ISO 27001. They're signed up to GDPR through the contractual mechanisms. So again, it's a real challenge, and it is trying to anticipate all the numerous things that can go wrong across your ecosystem, not just with AI. So it's a difficult time at the moment.
And maybe kind of a follow-on. I think we're seeing a really fragmented regulatory landscape globally in the AI space. I think, in particular in the UK, we recognise it's a pro-innovation kind of low-regulation approach, which arguably isn't helpful actually with where we are at the minute. Whereas the EU have been kind of maybe a global leader in kind of moving towards trying to regulate some of the applications of AI within the EU. And you've already mentioned kind of stricter controls within China around regulation. I'm wondering kind of from the perspective of your clients, how are they navigating that kind of fragmented regulatory landscape? And if you have do you think does geography, create an advantage for organizations in that space, or is it really a friction point?
Definitely friction, but I think there's an abundance of opportunity in the way the enterprise system is sort of collapsing at the moment. I think no longer can you assume that you can run your business on one tech stack and one security stack. We obviously have geopolitics playing out at a technology level between the US and China, the race for hard tech, for data flows. Then we have fragmenting regulatory environments, and part of that is rising middle powers using regulatory regimes as a way to flex sovereign muscle. So that's quite interesting. And again, you touched on the fact that there are different sort of values driving the regulatory approaches. China is very much driven by national security and stability, US by open competition and apparently national security. EU values and transparency-based, ethically driven, risk-based regulatory approaches. I think the challenge for the EU is they're no longer in the position to really set the global tone anymore, which is really difficult. And I think for global organizations that are looking to roll out technology, you have this like jurisdictional resilience challenge now. Again, sorry, I'm overusing resilience, but I think there are ways you can approach it within AI technology. You can layer in levels of governance that can be sort of scaled up and scaled down, or turned off and turned on. But I think we are seeing some companies, for example, leverage markets that are more open to trial pilot programs. But there are massive advantages to actually doubling down in markets such as China with much more advanced and strict regulatory regimes. We're working with one global healthcare company that has decided China is a very important market, so they're localizing, they're switching over to a Chinese tech stack. And it's because for their AI systems within some of their MRI machines, for example, in the China market, they're being given access to data sets they really could not get anywhere else. So for them, it's a massive strategic advantage in terms of the way they're actually being able to learn and train some of their machinery that they're competing with worldwide. So I think there's friction, but if you get it right, there's a host of opportunities. One other example I give is some clients we're working with in the Middle East who suddenly have the opportunity to work with a lot of hyperscalers, but they were running on 5G Huawei infrastructure, so they're having to de-Huawei-fy their 5G, but it's opening up a huge market for them with companies such as Google. So it's challenging, but if you get it right, there's opportunity.
De-Huawei-fy. You heard that here first. So there's just kind of one final question, then we'll do a bit of wrap-up perspectives. But so typically in an AI panel, if you've been around the circuit, you'll know that we usually ask a question at the end, where do you think we're going to be in 5 years' time? But I think with the advancement, of the technology, really the question has to be, looking ahead at 6 months' time, actually, 6 months from now, 1 year from now. What do you think will define enterprises who are succeeding in the AI space versus those who are going to fall behind? Lyndsay, maybe go to you first.
Yeah, I think probably 3 things from my point of view. So I think the winners are going to be the organizations who are able to lay the foundations now for a future that we don't really know what it's going to be like, deliver value incrementally along the way, and have the ability to pivot as things change, whether that's your tech stack or your strategy. I think that agility is going to be really important. Secondly, it's probably another one, it's not AI related, but the ability to leverage AI to reimagine their business or their processes, because we're all in the room probably going to have a Gen AI powered bot on our websites. We're all going to automate our processes. So I think the winners will be those who are able to identify new markets, new products, new value propositions for their customers. And then finally, another big part of my job is data. So I think it's the organizations who understand that their data and AI go hand in hand, and who can align their strategies because one enables the other.
Great. Caitlin, you have to say something different.
Okay, so I would say technology is strategy, because the infrastructure you invest in today takes the markets that you can operate in, people you can hire tomorrow, but ultimately resilience. That's integral, and it's hard trying to anticipate the risks. But as I said earlier, one of the big things we're seeing emerging in the US clients is actually not AI concerns, it's quantum concerns. You know, you're rolling out, investing in technology, but if there's a breakthrough in quantum and you haven't anticipated that, prepared for the cryptography challenges, it's a massive issue. So, resilience.
Not to alarm anyone in the room. You need to go and study up on quantum readiness. So, kind of quick fire, right? What's one thing an enterprise organization should stop doing now if they want to accelerate AI adoption? Lyndsay.
Well, I've learned a lot today as well, but I think one thing is, because I've seen this a little bit, stop focusing on AI in isolation. Hopefully it's come through today. There is so much more to be considered, so you need to identify those things that will enable AI and elevate them to the same level of focus.
I'd say from my startup years, it's shiny new thing syndrome. So actually, yes, strategy driving decisions. I was at, as I said, a crypto startup, and LLMs came on the scene, and suddenly all the VCs were running towards LLMs, and there was no money left in crypto. That was actually pretty short-sighted, because look at what's happening now at a blockchain financial services level. It's really exciting, actually. I love working with our crypto clients. So yeah, shiny new thing syndrome.
Okay, love that. So just to wrap up, I think we've heard about embedding AI into strategy, right? And not chasing shiny things, but actually kind of trying to balance that with governance and innovation. And I think, don't be the blocker, to your people innovating. And I think, balance the risk and the reward of doing that ultimately, and kind of build trust as you do that. So just wrapping up, I really wanted to thank Caitlin and Lyndsay for kind of coming to AICon today and to offer their perspectives. I think it's actually quite brave for sort of an enterprise organization to stand on a stage and say what their challenges are with AI adoption, right? It's so really appreciate the honesty and the transparency and kind of the challenges that you've shared there. And I hope that it was informative for everyone in the room. And if you have any questions, I'm sure Caitlin and Lyndsay will be happy to answer. But thank you very much for listening. Appreciate it.